Welcome. Read One Communications presents The Scholar's Chair. Tonight, the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. The historical context of religious significance of Kant's philosophy, as written by Theodore M. Green. The Enlightenment, which began in the 17th century and flourished in the 18th, constitutes one of the great spiritual movements of modern Europe. In it, we see the Renaissance working itself out through the agencies of its scientific and philosophical discoveries. We should recall at the outset the major characteristics of this movement. It was essentially revolutionary, directed against the authority of intellectual and religious tradition. The positive force at its core was a determinate assertion of the freedom of the individual, freedom in affairs social and political, intellectual and religious. This spirit expressed itself most emphatically in a new and extravagant belief in the power of reason. Faith in the old presuppositions and authorities, for so long considered valid beyond question, gave way to the spirit of criticism. The victory of the good over the evil principle and the founding of the kingdom of God on earth by Immanuel Kant. The combat which every morally well-disposed man must sustain in this life under the leadership of the good principle against the attacks of the evil principle can procure him, however much he asserts himself, no greater advantage than freedom from the sovereignty of evil. To become free, to be freed from the bondage under the law of sin, to live for righteousness, this is the highest prize he can win. He continues to be exposed, nonetheless, to the assault of the evil principle, and in order to assert his freedom, which is perpetually being attacked, he must ever remain armed for the fray. Now, man is in this perilous state through his own fault. Hence, he is bound, at the very least, to strive with all his might to extricate himself from it. But how? That is the question. When he looks around for the causes and circumstances which expose him to this danger and keeps him in it, he can easily convince himself that he is subject to these not because of his own gross nature, so far as he is here a separate individual, but because of mankind to whom he is related and bound. It is not at the instigation of the former that what should properly be called the passions, which cause such havoc in his original good predisposition, are aroused. His needs are but few, and his frame of mind in providing for them is temperate and tranquil. He is poor, or considers himself so, only in his anxiety lest other men consider him poor and despise him on that account. Envy, the lust for power, greed, and the malignant inclinations bound up with these, besiege his nature, contended within itself, as soon as he is among men. And it is not even necessary to assume that these are men stuck in evil, and examples to lead him astray. It suffices that they are at hand, that they surround him, and that they are men for them mutually to corrupt each other's predispositions and make one another evil. If no means could be discovered for the forming of an alliance uniquely designed as a protection against this evil, and for the furtherance of good in man, of society, enduring ever extending itself, aiming solely at the maintenance of morality and counteracting of evil with united forces. This association with others would keep man, however much as a single individual he may have done to throw off the sovereignty of evil, incessantly in danger of falling back under its dominion. As far as we can see, therefore, the sovereignty of the good principle is attainable, so far as men can work towards it, only through the establishment and spread of a society in accordance with and for the sake of the laws of virtue, a society whose task and duty is rationally to impress these laws in all their scope upon the entire human race, for only thus can we hope for a victory of the good over the evil principle. In addition to prescribing laws to each individual, morally legislative reason also unfurls a banner of virtue in a rallying point for all who love the good, that they may gather beneath it, and thus at the very start gain the upper hand over the evil which is attacking them without rest. A union of men, under merely moral laws, patterned on this idea, may be called an ethical. And so far as these laws are public, or an ethical commonwealth, it can exist in the midst of the political commonwealth and may even be made up of all its members. Indeed, unless it is based upon such a commonwealth, it can neither be brought into existence by man. It has, however, a special and unique principle of union, virtue, and hence a form and constitution which fundamentally distinguishes it from a political commonwealth. At the same time, there is a certain analogy between them, regardless as two commonwealths, in view in which the former may also be called an ethical state, i.e., a kingdom of virtue, of the good principle. The idea of such a state possesses a thoroughly well-grounded objective reality in human reason, in man's duty to join such a state, even though subjectively we can never hope that man's goodwill will lead mankind to decide to work with consensus towards this goal. Concerning the ethical state of nature, a juridical, civic, political state is the relations of men to each other, in which they all alike stand socially under political judicial laws. An ethical civic state is that in which they are united under non-coercive laws, i.e., laws of virtue alone. Now, just as the rightful, but not therefore always righteous, i.e., the juridical state of nature is opposed to the first, the ethical state of nature, is distinguished from the second. In both, each individual prescribes the law for himself, and there is no external law to which he, along with all others, recognize himself to be subject. In both, each individual is his own judge, and there exists no powerful public authority to determine with legal power, according to laws, what is each man's duty in every situation that arises, and to bring about the universal performance of duty. In an already existing political commonwealth, all the political citizens, as such, are in an ethical state of nature and are entitled to remain therein. For it would be a contradiction for the political commonwealth to compel its citizens to enter into an ethical commonwealth since the very concept of the latter involves freedom from coercion. Every political commonwealth may indeed wish to be possessed of a sovereignty, according to laws of virtue, over the spirit of its citizens. For then, when its methods of compulsion do not avail, for the human judge cannot penetrate into the depths of other men, their dispositions to virtue would bring about what was required. But woe to the legislator who wishes to establish through force or polity, directed to ethical ends. For in so doing, he will not merely achieve the very opposite of his ethical piety, but also undermine his political state and make it insecure. The citizen of political commonwealth remains therefore, so far as its legislative function is concerned, completely free to enter with his fellow citizens into an ethical union in addition to the political, or to remain in this kind of state of nature as he may wish. Only so far as the ethical commonwealth must rest on public laws and possess a constitution based on these laws are those who freely pledge themselves to enter into an ethical state bound not indeed to accept orders from the political power as to how they shall or shall not fashion this ethical constitution internally, but to agree to limitations, namely to the conditions that this constitution shall contain nothing which contradicts the duty of its members as citizens of the state. Further, because the duty of virtue applies to the entire human race, the concept of the ethical commonwealth is extended ideally to the whole of mankind, and therefore distinguishes itself from the concept of a political commonwealth. Hence, even a large number of men united in that purpose can be called not an ethical commonwealth itself, but only a particular society which strives towards the harmony with all men, yes, finally, with all rational beings, in order to form an absolute ethical whole, of which every partial society is only a representation. For each of these societies, in turn, in its relations to others of the same kind, can be represented as the ethical state of nature and subject to all the defects thereof. This is precisely the situation with separate political states. To become a member of an ethical commonwealth, just as the juridical state of nature is one of war of every man against every other, so too is the ethical state of nature one in which the good principle which reside in each man is continually attacked by the evil, which is found in him and also in everyone else. Men mutually corrupt one another's moral predispositions, despite the good will of each individual, yet because they lack a principle which unites them, dissensions from the common goal of goodness, and just as though they were instruments of evil, expose one another to the risk of falling once again under the sovereignty of evil principle. Again, just as the state of a lawless internal freedom and independence from coercive laws is a state of injustice and of war each against each, which a man ought to leave in order to enter into a political civic state, so is the ethical state of nature one of open conflict between principles of virtue and a state of inner immorality which the natural man ought to exert himself to leave as soon as possible. Now here we have a duty which is not of men towards men, but of the human race towards itself. For the species of rational beings is objectively, in the idea of reason, the sin for a social goal, namely the promotion of the highest as a social good. But because the highest moral good cannot be achieved merely by the assertion of the single individual towards his own moral perfection, but requires rather a union of such individuals into a whole towards the same goal, into a system of well-disposed men in which and through whose unity alone the highest moral good can come to pass. The idea of such a whole, as a universal republic based on laws of virtue, is an idea completely distinguished from all moral laws. Hence, this duty is distinguished from all others both in kind and in principle. We can already foresee that this duty will require the presupposition of another idea, namely, that of a higher moral being through whose universal dispensation the forces of separate individuals, insufficient in themselves, are united for a common end. First of all, however, we must follow up the clue that the moral need for social union and see where this will lead us. It is Immanuel Kant who continues that the concept of an ethical commonwealth is the concept of the people of God under ethical laws. If an ethical commonwealth is to come into being, all single individuals must be subject to a public legislation, and all the laws which binds them must be capable of being regarded as commands of a common lawgiver. Now, if the commonwealth to be established is to be juridical, the master people, uniting itself into a whole, would itself have to be the lawgiver of constitutional laws, because legislation proceeds from the principle of limiting the freedom of each of those conditions under which it can be consistent with the freedom of everyone else according to a common law. And because, as a result, the general will set up an external legal condition. But if the commonwealth is to be ethical, the people, as a people, cannot itself be regarded as the lawgiver. For in such a commonwealth all the laws are expressly designed to promote the morality of action, which is something inner, and hence cannot be subject to public human laws, whereas, in contrast, these public laws, and this would go to constitute a juridical commonwealth, are directed only towards the legality of actions, which meets the eye, and not towards inner morality, which alone is in question here. There must therefore be someone other than the populace capable of being specified as the public lawgiver for an ethical commonwealth, and yet ethical laws cannot be thought of as emanating originally merely from the will of this supreme being, as statutes which, have he not first commanded them, would perhaps not be binding. For then they would not be ethical laws, and the duty proper to them would not be the free duty of virtue, but the coercive duty of law. Hence, only he can be thought of as the highest lawgiver of an ethical commonwealth with respect to whom all true duties, hence also the ethical, must be represented as, at the same time, his commands, He must therefore also be one who knows the heart, in order to see into the innermost parts of the disposition of each individual, and, as is necessary in every commonwealth, to bring it about that each receives whatever his actions are worth. But this is the concept of God as moral ruler of the world. Hence, the ethical commonwealth can be thought of only as a people under divine commands, i.e., as a people of God, and indeed under laws of virtue. We might indeed conceive of a people of God under statutory laws. Under such laws, that obedience to them would concern not the morality, but merely the legality of actions. This would be a juridical commonwealth of which indeed God would be the lawgiver. Hence the constitution of the state would be theocratic. But men, as priests, receiving his behests from him directly, would build up an aristocratic government. Such a constitution, however, whose existence and form rest wholly on a historical basis, cannot settle the problem of the morally legislative reason, the solution of which alone we are to effect. As an institution under political civic laws, whose lawgiver, through God, is yet external, it will come under review in the historical section. Here we have to do only with an institution whose laws are purely inward, a republic under laws of virtue, i.e., a people of God, zealous of good works. To such a people of God we can oppose the idea of a rattle of evil principle, the union of those who side with it for the propagation of evil, and whose interest it is to prevent the realization of that other union. Although here again, the principle which combats virtuous dispositions lies in our very selves, and is represented only figuratively as an external power. Immanuel Kant further writes, "The idea of a people of God can be realized through human organization only in the form of a church. The sublime, yet never wholly attainable, idea of an ethical commonwealth dwindles markedly under man's hands. It becomes an institution which, at best capable of representing only the pure form of such a commonwealth, is, by the conditions of sensuous human nature, largely circumscribed in its means for establishing such a whole. How indeed can one expect something perfectly straight to be framed out of such crooked wood? To find a moral people of God is therefore a task whose consummation can be looked for not from men, but only from God himself. Yet man is not entitled, on this account, to be idle in this business, and to let providence rule, as though each could apply himself exclusively to his own private moral affairs and relinquish to the higher wisdom all the affairs of the human race as regards its moral destiny. Rather, such men proceed as though everything depends on him. Only on this condition dare he hope that higher wisdom will grant the completion of his well-intentioned endeavors. This wish of all well-disposed people is, therefore, that the kingdom of God come, and that his will be done on earth. But what preparations must we now make that it shall come to pass? An ethical commonwealth under divine moral legislation is a church which, so far as it is now an object of possible experience, is called the church invisible, a mere idea of the union of all righteous under direct and moral divine world government, an idea serving all of the archetypes of what is to be established by men. The visible church is the actual union of men into a whole which harmonizes with the ideal. So far as each separate society maintains, under public laws, an order among its members in the relationship of those who obey its laws to those who direct their obedience, the group, united into a whole, the church, is a congregation on authority, who call teachers or shepherds of souls, merely administer the affairs of the invisible supreme head thereof. In this function they are all called servants of the church, just as in the political commonwealth the visible overlord occasionally calls himself the highest servant of the state, even though he recognizes no individual over him, and ordinarily not even a people as a whole. The true visible church is that which exhibits the moral kingdom of God on earth so far as it can be brought to pass by men. The requirements upon, and hence the token of, the true church is the following: universality, and hence its numeral oneness, for which it must possess this characteristic, that although divided and at variance in unessential opinions, it is nonetheless, with respect to its fundamental intention, founded upon such basic principles as must necessarily lead to a general unification in a single church, thus no sectarian divisions. Its nature, quality, i.e., purity, union under no motivating forces other than moral ones, purified of the stupidity of superstition and of the madness of fanaticism. Its relations under the principle of freedom, both the internal of its members to one another and the external relations to the church to political power. Both relations, as in a republic, hence neither a hierarchy nor an illuminatism, which is a kind of democracy, through special inspiration where the inspiration of one person can differ from that of another, according to the whims of each. Since our religion consists in this, that in all our duties we look upon God as the lawgiver universally to be honored, the determining of religion, so far as the conformity of our attitude with it is concerned. Hence, upon knowing how God wishes to be honored and obeyed. Now, a divine legislative will commands either through laws in themselves merely statutory, or through purely moral laws. As to the latter, each individual can know of himself through his own reason the will of God, which lies at the basis of his religion. For the concept of divinity really arises solely through consciousness of these laws, and from the need of reason to postulate a might which can procure for these laws as the final end all the results conformable to them and possible in the world. The concept of a divine will, determined according to pure moral laws alone, allows us to think of only one religion, which is purely moral, as it did of only one God.